All right. So, hello everyone. So, today I wanted to focus on the particular term mechanism in debate. So, back then, mechanism wasn't really used a lot, that much in like when I first started off debating. And I think what people used to do was that they would um, provide many uh, reasons for why certain claims were true, certain characterizations are true, but eventually, I think the reason why the term mechanism became very popular in the debate community was because there was this expectation that it's not so much as providing reasons for why something is true, but it is about also providing why your side through the motion uniquely gets the particular benefits or harms that you are trying to claim that are as a consequence of the motion. So, the term mechanism sounds very industrial, right? Sounds very like operational. And so I think that's only because there is an expectation that you want to be very concrete with your explanation of why something is likely to be true. And so here's my take on what a mechanism means. Mechanism most definitely just means that they are logical pathways to prove a particular claim. So that's a very universal definition. It will definitely be applicable in many contexts, and that is usually how people use it in the debate parlance, so to speak. And so, what I want to do today is understand the role of mechanisms in an argument. Like, why are they important, and why do people adopt the usage of like emphasizing these mechanisms a lot in a particular argument, and how can you incorporate that into your own arguments as well? So what do I mean? A mechanism, again, looking back at the definition, it is a logical pathway. What do we mean? A logical pathway simply means that you are providing a very isolated, very specific argumentative reason, that there is some logic that X can lead to Y, or that X contributes to Y, etc. Whatever. An example would be, and I do need to go immediately into an example here because it should already be very evident that, with the rise of trying to make many independent mechanisms in an argument, that's a term that you'll see a lot. What people are really doing is that they're trying to provide independent logical pathways to proving why the argument is true. So, for example, if the claim that they are making is the construction of US military bases undermines the autonomy of the host nation, right? That is the argument, or that is the specific claim that they're trying to explain, that there is the creation of a US military base, the construction of such itself undermines the autonomy of the host nation. So it's about autonomy and it's about the host nation. And so there are three ways in which this might happen. Number one, it happens by stifling the development of a domestic military. Number two, by crowding out other potential military alliances. And number three, by creating dependence on the US military for national security. So I hope you understand why this is an attempt towards being relatively more independent as mechanisms from each other. Or at least they're trying to show three different pathways for why, even if you don't believe one of them, it is relatively more likely to be true, that they will overall undermine the autonomy of the host nation. So now you're like, okay, game, let's explain how this happens. So the first reason is related to the creation of a domestic military versus not a domestic military, and the US construction of a military base is likely going to make it harder and harder for the government to justify funding their own military forces because they could focus on other things as a consequence. So you could find a way to make this mechanism very, very charitable to opposition, but saying that you will stifle that development, thereby undermining autonomy. So that's why it's like, okay, at some point, I must say why this undermines autonomy, but at some point, I must also say, why does this happen as a consequence of US military base? So that's a very important thing that you have to keep in mind. Number two, now you're like, oh, it's not only about domestic military versus not domestic military. It's also about our ability to cooperate with other military powers and also engage geopolitically or diplomatically with those powers outside of, our current US relationship with the US military. So it's like, oh, so there's a crowding out mechanism. It's not only for myself, it's also about for other people, alliances with other people. So that also is a consequence of a US military base, but also it undermines the autonomy of the host nation. And then number three, even if you don't believe that they stop the domestic military development, or even if you don't believe that we cannot create an alliance with other nations, what you should believe is that if the US military base becomes very present and prominent there, and then you could provide additional sub reasons within that. You create you put nuclear warheads that are very proximate to the US military base. There's the infrastructure of military development, or even like the establishment of many US businesses in that US military base. You're gonna be like, oh wait, there is a dependence on this US military base, and thereby an overall dependence on the US military for national security. So now, even if it's not about cooperating with other nations, for my own nation, I am always beholden and I have less leverage against the US military. So notice how even in this logical pathway, there's like a lot of other impacts that you could talk about that are not related to autonomy of the host nation. But right now, we're just isolating the argument, right? We're isolating the argument to saying that it is about undermining the autonomy of the host nation, construction of the US military. Let's focus on this first. And of course, independent of whether the argument is good or not, what you need to understand is, what does the mechanism do? Does the mechanism give me insight on what the overriding or the fundamental comparatives are? What are the fundamental assumptions that are, tied with that mechanism, etc., etc. Like that's very important, because that is its own logical structure within a reason, right? Like, the reasons are not just like, static. Like, these reasons are very, very, very tied with its own implication and process. And that's what I wanted to highlight at the last part here, no? What I wanted to say is that when they are elaborated within an argument specifically, usually what you will notice is that a mechanism commonly follows the structure of operation or process leading towards an implication or a consequence that does reinforce the particular claim that is being made. So for example, if the motion were, this House regrets the demonization of colonialism in post-colonial states, you would say, this is a motion from UADC recently, very, very nice motion. Also very, very common to talk about motions related to the vilification of colonialism in post-colonial states, and all the ways in which it could contribute to disunity within that state. If that were the motion and the argument was as follows: the demonization of colonialism contributed to the rise of authoritarian governments in three particular ways. And these are three relatively independent mechanisms that we're going to try and build in the argument. Number one, that voting in military leaders who campaigned on a platform of anti-colonial resistance allowed them to subvert democratic processes, justifying prolonged government rule. So it's like, oh yeah, wait. Notice that there is the process, which is you are voting in a military leader, right? And there is the implication. They have prolonged government rule as a consequence, and that itself reinforces authoritarian regimes. Number two, You kick out foreign institutions affiliated with former colonial powers, which enabled local oligarchs to collude with the government, creating an over-reliance on that same government. So it's like, notice again, even in the process, right? This process, the operation, kicking out foreign institutions affiliated with former colonial powers, right? It is tied with another process, right? Enabling local oligarchs to collude with the government, thereby, and the implication, creating an over-reliance on the government, having stronger regulatory control and regulatory collusion with its same oligarchs, which mutually reinforce corruption in the regime, thereby, again, leading to the rise of authoritarian governments in this sense. And then the last one would be, specifically with respect to anti-colonial rhetoric, the censorship of the remnants of colonial history, or at least positive remnants of colonial history or whatever, or any remnants from the previous regime. It led to social indoctrination, enabling extended government overreach and less checks and balances of government propaganda. And then, of course, you could find other ways to try and make consequences out of this particular mechanism, such as, extreme nationalism, xenophobia, etc., etc. That's all possible if you wanted to. But again, what's very important is the discipline to connecting it to the rise of authoritarian governments. That's why I focused on censorship here, which is that, if there is an incentive to censor more and more information and to only focus on the government rhetoric, and, that you have to always paint them and demonize them more and more, and that you are caught up in this cycle of demonization, then it becomes easier and easier for that government to justify more and more overreaches of power as a consequence. So now it's like, okay, notice the linear or parallel structure in these mechanisms. That one, it's about voting in military leaders. Number two, about kicking out foreign institutions. And number three, about censorship of remnants of colonial history. When you're responding to many multi-layered mechanisms, hopefully you should understand that this is the underlying condition of the argument for it to work. That these are critical mechanisms that are inherent to the demonization, right? And that as a consequence, because this is a key mechanism, you should thereby believe the rest of the implications that are tied with that mechanism. And so now you're like, okay, if I'm going to respond to the argument on the rise of authoritarian governments and then demonization, and then you want to make an argument that says that no, demonization allowed for the facilitation of democratic institutions, you can't just argue that in general, right? You have to first have the discipline to unpack or at least disassociate these mechanisms from this particular characterization of demonization and how it likely manifests, or you try and include a different understanding of the comparative, right? You want to say that, maybe it was necessary to have strong authoritarian rule so that we could prevent, neo-colonial capture by those foreign institutions, which would have otherwise happened in the absence of this demonization. So it's like, oh, okay, I'm specifying the comparative. I could accept certain mechanisms over others, like voting in military leaders or maybe kicking out foreign institutions. Maybe these might have had some good contributions in some extent, but now it's like, okay, now I have to unpack the extent to which this is actually a critical mechanism for the argument to be true, right? You could say that kicking out foreign institutions doesn't necessarily lead to the rise of authoritarian regimes. Maybe it actually makes it easier for us to be independent from the same forces that allow us to become more authoritarian, right? That might be possible. Maybe, etc., etc., right? So this is always a very, very, very important exercise when understanding the way in which a mechanism situates itself within the logical, the true or false conditions of a particular argument. And then that hopefully should make it a little bit easier for you, not only to just build your own arguments, but in my opinion, it should also make it a little bit easier for you to understand the discipline of responding, not having to respond to every single thing in responding to this implication and then this implication. You can't do that, right? It's always about knowing what strategic battles you need to take for your frame to work, right? Because your goal is to win the round, not to beat out every argument. Your goal is to prioritize the particular strategic trade-offs that you would need to make, and that necessitates knowing which mechanisms are most critical for your trade-off to work. in the end, at the end of the round. Okay, so that's fantastic. So this video is only just about acknowledging the purpose of a mechanism and defining what a mechanism is. So again, the bottom line is a mechanism is nothing more than just a logical pathway. People try and layer their arguments with many, many, many logical pathways because that shows that they're trying to be as comprehensive as possible. I don't want to say that that's the end all be all of debating, that there will still be many, many arguments that are very strong with one very, very strong mechanism. And that mechanism could be layered with multiple different reasons beneath it. And that's why any logical pathway, as we've shown in this particular video, is tied with, many other implications that you should also evaluate as well. And so, in very seemingly comprehensive speeches, what you should notice is that there are some parts that are less explained than others, and that allows you the opportunity to be able to unpack and focus on what you think is most critical for you to win. Okay, fantastic. Thank you very much. Have a great day.